Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please fasten your seatbelts, then sit back and relax. Get ready to fly by night. Now your host, Ken Sevara.
Hey, we have another great show for you. The show is Fly By Night. I am Ken Sevara. And you know, Chicago has always been a great comedy town. And over the past 4 decades, we have had many great rooms. And here are just a few. And you guys may recognize some of these names. We've had the Comedy Woman Lions, the Comedy Cottage in Rosemont, the Funny Firm on Ohio Street in Chicago, the First Improv, which is only a block away from that, Catch a Rising Star at the Hyatt Regency, the Funny Bones, and countless one-nighters. And through it all, only one club was left standing. Only one. And that club is Zanies. And I think that's a great way to start our interview with my guest, the Executive Vice President of Zanies Comedy Clubs, a great friend and sponsor of Fly By Night, Bert Haas. So that's a good starting point. Why has Zanies been able to outlast all of the other clubs?
Excellent question, Ken. I think the reason is that we've focused only on one thing, and that is stand-up comedy. And we believe that stand-up comedy is an art form. It should be presented in an intimate environment. While an artist can become big enough to do shows at the United Center, those really aren't stand-up comedy shows. Stand-up comedy shows are presented best in an intimate environment, and that's what Zanies is.
Now, a lot of other clubs have come in. I remember when Catch a Rising Star came in. They thought that it would be a great idea to do a cabaret night. And, you know, that's fine in New York. Yeah. But that doesn't work in Chicago. Chicago's always been kind of a weekend town, hasn't it?
That, I think, is another reason that we've been successful, is that we're from Chicago. I grew up here. Rick Hewitt, the owner of Zanies, is a Chicago native. And we know the market. A lot of the people come in from out of town with these ideas of, well, this worked in Los Angeles or this worked in New York, so therefore Chicago's going to just... And Chicagoans aren't like that. We're kind of xenophobic in that experience. We like our stuff.
Is Chicago ever been anything other than a weekend town?
Boy, it's tough. It's tough. What people have to keep in mind, Chicago's a working town. And so it's very hard to get people to come out on weekdays because we work.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, we don't stay in and because we're in the central time zone, we keep kind of normal hours. You know? It's not like on the East Coast where they start things at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night. Well, most of us are in bed.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Now, you had brought up the founder of Zanies Comedy Club's name.
My friend and mentor. And
yes, Rick Hewitt.
Right.
Tell me about Rick. And he passed away.
We just lost Rick a year ago.
Yes.
After a tough fight with cancer. And I first met Rick in 1980 when I started at Zanies. Zanies opened on Wells Street in 1978. And that is still open. That location is still open. It's the 4th oldest club in the country in the original location. Rick was really a visionary. When he started the business, there was no full-time stand-up room, professional stand-up room. There were a couple of showcase rooms. The Comedy Cottage was out in Rosemont.
And Dreesen had started La Pub.
Yeah, and the La Pub was on, I think, a one-nighter. And I think Tom also did the Pickle Barrel.
Yes, he did.
Which was also a one-nighter. But Zanies was the first full-time stand-up club. And what Rick did was he said Chicago's ready for this. Because one thing is that Chicago is really an improv town. And has been and should be because of Second City.
Sure.
And so stand-up is always kind of like the ugly stepchild in Chicago.
And I remember in the early days of Zanies that the only people that would come into that club were the overflow crowds from Second City.
Right.
And they were not really happy about having to sit through stand-up shows. And I remember, I used to think, oh my God, this is one of the toughest rooms I've ever been in, because they would come in with their arms folded and they would look like, make me laugh, I dare you.
Yeah.
And
we had a lot of heckling back then because they thought it was improv and they were supposed to shout suggestions. And it was like, well, no, the stand-ups have their own act. They really don't need you.
Yeah, exactly. Give me a place. Yeah. But, and Rick was like the godfather of it all.
Well, Rick was an innovator in so many ways. First of all, he was the first, prior to 1978, most comedians got paid by the show.
Yeah.
And if you were in LA or New York and you did one show, you got paid for one show. If you did 10 shows, you got paid per set. And the Comedy Cottage paid that way. Rick was the first one to say, no, you guys are professionals, you're artists, you need X amount of money, and you're going to be paid by the week.
Sure.
And if the show doesn't go on, you still get your money. You know what your budget is.
Yeah.
He was also the first club to do 3 shows on a Saturday night. For which now almost every club does, and all the comedians hated him for that. But
because you don't know if you've already said something.
Yeah.
You get to that third show and you go, did I say that?
Right.
Yeah, you said it. 2 shows, for 2 shows you said it.
And I remember when we went to 3 shows, all the comedians were like, this is impossible. And then and other clubs were like, you can't do 3 shows. And now every club does 3 shows on Saturday. Yeah. Rick was one of the first people in the country to put original artwork in the venue. Now you go to restaurants and they have local artists that have hanging original work. Rick did that in 1980 with Bob Fisher.
Yeah.
That was part of the Zanies look.
Yes.
And the other thing that Rick did was Rick had a great eye for talent.
He really did.
Always introducing new faces, new people, and that's how Zanies got its reputation as being a great place for stand-up comedy. Not only because we put on great shows, and Rick trained me to do that, but also because Rick had a great eye for talent and introduced people to this market that had never been in the market before.
Sure. And this is a guy who had rough beginnings. I mean,
what people don't understand, Rick was, he was a decorated war veteran. He spent a year in the VA hospital. He was wounded in Vietnam.
Right.
And spent a year in the hospital recovering from his wounds. And he was basically on disability when he started when he got out, and then he started in the nightclub business.
And even before him, his father was in Auschwitz.
Oh, my God. That's a whole separate story. His father was an Auschwitz survivor.
Unbelievable. And here's a guy who comes out of all of this suffering, and he is responsible for bringing that many laughs to the world.
Right.
And that's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, what an American...
Well, you knew Rick. He had a great sense of humor.
Great guy.
Tom Dreesen has always said that the mark of someone having a sense of humor is not their ability to tell jokes. It's their ability to laugh at themselves.
Yeah.
And Rick would laugh at himself.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was not afraid to laugh at himself. And that's why I think he got along with comedians, because you guys would bust his chops.
Oh, yeah.
And he would laugh. He had a great sense of humor.
But he was always treated guys really well. Mm-hmm. And, and I can only speak personally, but he was always fantastic to me. He helped launch my career. Mm-hmm. It gave us stage time, paid us for doing it, and that's what I remember about him, But for a guy to come out of that kind of suffering and go to the heights that he did, and Leno loves him. I know that Jay Leno loves Rick.
Yeah, they had a real close friendship.
So Rick started the club at around 78, right?
The club opened in November 78.
And why did he start it?
Because there really wasn't anything like it. He had the space. He was approached by his cousin, who said, "Hey, we have this idea." There were these showcase rooms out in the suburbs, the Comedy Cottage, the Comedy Womb, but there wasn't really a room like that in the city. There wasn't a full-time comedy club. You had Sylvester's on Lincoln Avenue, but they would do music, they would do improv, they would do everything. And so Rick said, "Yeah, this could be fun. Let's give it a try." And then he just stuck with it. And there were some lean years, Man, there were some lean years. I don't need to tell you, because you remember that, and everyone goes, "Oh yeah, Zanies, they must have made so much money." Yeah, it's a successful club. We've been there for 34 years. I can remember weeks where Rick went into his pocket and paid guys out of his pocket.
Sure.
Because it was slow. And, what people forget is there was an incredible recession in this country from 1980 to almost 1983.
Yeah.
Unemployment was at 11%. The prime was at 20%.
Right.
And that was a tough time.
And I remember and I know you know this story, that the guy who called up and had Rick explain stand-up comedy to him.
Oh, yeah, because I had it all the time. I would answer the phone and people would say, "What do you do there? Are you like Second City?" "No, we do stand-up comedy." "Does that mean we have to bring our own chairs?" Or does that mean we have to stand up? And because prior to the Seinfeld show, people really didn't know what a stand-up comedian did.
Yes.
That's what Jerry Seinfeld did, aside from being a great stand-up comedian, is he made it part of the mainstream.
But you always had stand-up in some form in Chicago with Mr. Kelly's and the Playboy circuit at that time. There was stand-up, but unless you were maybe from the Catskills, the Borscht Belt, whatever, or the Chitlin circuit that Dreesen and Tim Reed were on, the idea of stand-up comedy was for and outside of urban areas especially.
For stand-up comedy as the only form of entertainment.
Yeah.
Those clubs you cited would have a musician and a comedian.
Yes.
They didn't have a 3-act all-comedy show.
Yes.
And that's what Zanies did, was the first club to say, okay, we're only going to do comedy. Comedy as an art form can stand on its own, like jazz.
Yes. Were you guys the first in the country to do it that way?
Pretty close.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say pretty close, because up till then, every other club was a showcase club.
Well, we're going to be right back. We're going to be talking to Bert Haas about, everything. You and I could go for hours, you know?
Well, let's not bore everybody. Let's try and talk about something interesting.
Well, you know what? But you're a great guest. We are Fly By Night, and we're going to be right back after these important messages. Stick around. AM560 WIND.
No 2-hour security lines when you fly by night. Now back to the show with your host, Ken Sevara.
We are here with the Executive Vice President of Zanies Comedy Club and a great friend of mine, a guy I have known from the very beginnings of my comedy career, Bert Haas. And I wanted to know, how did you start your career at Zanies? You know, it's not something you would see your high school counselor about. You know, what do you want to do, kid? Well, I want to manage comedy clubs. You know, it's not something that's probably a routine job.
Well, first of all, let me say that my official title is Executive Vice President. And the reason I'm an Executive Vice President is it gives the impression there's more than one Vice President.
A conglomerate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we are a huge company.
In reality, I'm the only Vice President. You know, the way I started, I when I graduated from school, I was working for a market research firm down in the Loop.
Yeah.
And I was planning to go back to Germany. And
now, what had you been doing in Germany
I had spent
previously?
a year in Germany previously as part of my education.
Oh, okay.
And I had intended to go back and get a master's degree. And then I started working at Zanies as a part-time job. Rick was gone 1 week. I somehow got a job as a waiter. Rick comes back. He takes one look at me on the floor. By the way, I was the world's worst waiter. Absolute world's worst waiter. And Rick looks at me on the floor, and he's shaking his head. And by the third week, I show up, and he goes, I think we're going to put you on the door. And so then I was the host, and and then I became like the part-time manager.
Oh,
and then by then I met my wife, Sally, and I love comedy. I love Sally, and I never went back to Germany. And then I just really love comedy. I always have. It's just a calling.
But did you know at that time how much you loved comedy?
You know, I've always, I think when one of the key points in my life was when I was a sophomore in high school, my sister gave me Lenny Bruce's autobiography. And I've since asked her, why did you give that to me when I was in high school? She goes, she didn't even remember giving it to me.
Yeah.
But I read that book and thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever read. And I think that's when I really got hooked on comedy.
So that was the catalyst.
Yeah.
That's what brought you into it.
I think so.
And then
I read all of Alan King's books. I thought those were hilarious. Help! I'm a prisoner in a Chinese fortune cookie factory, and anybody who owns his own house deserves it. I would read all his books, and I thought, oh, this is hilarious. And then I would see stand-up comedy. I would, whenever I could, try and stay up on the Tonight Show watching comedians, and I just love stand-up comedy.
Now, what are your duties? Your daily duties as the Executive Vice President of Zanies?
Now, my bosses aren't listening, are they?
No, I don't think so. Well, this is on late at night, so you know what? People are in bed.
Okay, so I don't have to hide anything. Well, my biggest responsibility is booking the talent.
Okay.
I book the comedians for all three Zanies here at the one in Chicago, of course, the one in St. Charles, and then our newsroom in Rosemont. Mm-hmm. That's my number one priority, is always looking for new talent, maintaining the quality of the show.
So you're like a baseball scout in many respects. While you have the regular mainstay talent going, you're scouting new talent.
Always looking.
Have to keep that club fresh.
Right.
Keep the new talent coming up from AAA.
Right.
And
always looking for the next phenom, trying to find that next Mickey Mantle. Absolutely. I should probably update that reference.
Maybe. Frank Thomas.
Yeah,
or something.
I should. Yeah. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And because what we want to do is what Zanies is a small room, and as the comedians grow, they obviously grow into doing concerts and doing big events, like I alluded to earlier. You know, Kevin Hart, when he works at Kevin Hart worked at Zanies. Now he does the United Center. Mm-hmm. That's great. Dane Cook did Zanies. Now then he goes and does the Allstate Arena.
Sure.
That's a different show.
Right.
That's not the intimacy of stand-up comedy. That's a huge entertainment.
And the downtown room is so beautiful because what I love about it is, first of all, it's got that retro feeling. You know,
Right.
it's got that feeling of that 70s nightclub. It's a warm, a very warm building where the people are very in tight. It's a very intimate setting. And then the other room in St. Charles is more of a kind of a spread out setting a little more. What is the room in Rosemont like? I haven't seen it yet, and I'm going there next week to check it out.
I think the room in Rosemont is actually our best room because what we did, we tried to correct all the mistakes that we have from the other rooms.
Right.
And the architect in our Rosemont room really understood what we were trying to do, and it's set up, it's tiered, but it's set up almost like a coliseum.
Sure.
That it's all around the stage. It's very intimate. It's really a small room. A lot of clubs are opening big rooms, 500-seat rooms, 700-seat rooms. That's not the Zanies philosophy. Our philosophy is that stand-up comedy is an intimate art form. And so we want a room to be intimate. The furthest seat in Rosemont is about 30 feet from the stage.
Sure.
That's the back row. That's the back row.
Phenomenal.
You're about 30 feet from the stage.
Yeah, and comics really appreciate that because, you know, it's always when you go into some of these rooms, they're real long, narrow rooms, and they go back forever and ever. And you know that in those rooms, and that's what I like about the downtown room, even the furthest seat back is close in.
Right.
You know, you're going to lose 1/3 of that crowd if it's too long. And, you know, but you guys always have, I mean, you never have to worry as an entertainer when you show up at Zanies. First of all, the room managers that you have are unbelievable.
Well, I'd like to do a shout out because Martine has an institution in Chicago.
Absolutely.
He's been there for, I don't know, I think 25 years.
And they think Cal Ripken, you know.
Well, Martine, let me see. He works 50 weeks a year, 6 nights a week.
Yes.
And the only reason he doesn't work 52 weeks is I insist he take 2 weeks vacation.
So who's the real Iron Man?
Oh, absolutely.
Cal Ripken or
Martine
Martine?
Bayon, absolutely. Martine. And then Cindy, of course, does a great job in Rosemont. We got Tracy Whitmer in St. Charles, who loves comedy. What we always look for is people that like comedy and want to be around comedy.
Right.
I've never understood stories that I hear from comedians. They go on the road, they get back, and they go, yeah, boy, the manager was so unhappy about being there. How could you be unhappy about being in a comedy club?
Right. Well, you know, you can always tell, too, because the first thing I do, if I go into a new room, I watch the wait staff. If that wait staff is unhappy, it comes from the top down.
Right.
It's going to be a really long week. If they're tense, it's going to bleed into that crowd, and you know what I'm saying.
Exactly.
You know, it's going to bleed over, and it's going to be a painful week for the comic. Or if there's, and you do this very well also, and I've learned this from you. You always make certain that the people working together like one another. There's never friction in the show.
Rick taught me that when I first started hiring. I said, I've never hired anyone. What do I do? He said, first of all, hire someone you want to work with.
Yeah.
Someone you enjoy. And I thought, yeah, that's just so commonsensical, but how many times do people not do that? Oh, well, according to his resume, he's perfect for the job, so I'm going to hire him. Do you like him? I hate him. Well, why would you want to work with him then?
So the philosophy gets simpler as you.
And the other thing that Rick always stressed was relationships, and this is what he taught. Cindy will tell you that this was the number one thing Rick taught her was this is a relationship business, and you want the comedian to be happy. You don't want them to look upon it as just a paycheck. You want them to look for it.
Sure.
And I always look for it. You know, usually an out-of-town comedian will work for us once a year because of the rotation. They're working other cities. By the time I get them back in, it's every 12 months, every 14 months. Man, when I see those guys again, it's like seeing an old friend.
Yeah.
When Kenny Rogerson comes to town, I'm ecstatic. When Tom Rhodes gets his week, you know. Richard Lewis last week. Bobby Slayton, I haven't seen Bobby in over a year. You know, this is like seeing old friends again.
Well, and you've always made me feel that way when I've come into the club.
Well, I'm a good faker.
Well, so is it. But Martine is like that also. You know, you walk in that club, he's got a huge smile on his face. Same with Cindy. Same with Tracy.
Right.
There's always a feel-good atmosphere in your clubs. What do you like most about your job? I mean, that's one of the things.
Well, obviously, dealing with the comedians is the greatest pleasure. And to me, it's fascinating to see the career paths of comedians. And you've been doing this a long time, Ken. You know that people that 25 years ago, had we put a list together and said, oh, this guy's going straight to the top.
Sure.
Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. What the public doesn't always understand is it's not just talent. It's talent, it's work, and it's luck.
Yeah.
And there's an element of luck. And you'll talk to someone like Jeff Foxworthy and Larry the Cable Guy. Very funny comedians. Deserve all the success they've achieved. But if you talk to them, they'll say, yeah, we were lucky.
Mm-hmm.
Leno, great work ethic, great comedian. He got lucky.
But I do know about Jay.
Yeah.
When he was campaigning for The Tonight Show, if he was on the road, he would go into affiliates.
He made his luck.
He
worked his butt off.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
He'd walk in those affiliates, introduce himself, and campaign for that job.
Right.
And so by the time he got The Tonight Show, every satellite out there who was affiliated with NBC knew exactly who he was.
I don't know if people understand how much work goes into it. Because you guys make it seem so effortless on stage. Like, hey, we're just up here winging some jokes. Professional comedians have my highest respect. You guys work your butts off.
Well, and what people don't see, I think, they see the 45 minutes on stage. And the 45 minutes on stage looks really fun. They don't see the packing, the unpacking, the going to the dry cleaners, eating fast, lousy food on the road. They don't see any of that stuff. What we do...
Well, let's bring the whole show down by telling them about the rigors of life.
Well, you have to make it look effortless. Hey, this is Fly By Night, AM560 WIND. We're with Bert Haas. We'll be right back.
Fasten your seatbelts. You're back on the air with Fly By Night.
We are having a lot of fun with our guest, the Executive Vice President of Zanies Comedy Clubs, Bert Haas.
Well, you and I are having a lot of fun, Ken. I hope they're enjoying it.
Oh, yeah, I hope so. Debbie's laughing. My producer, she's
Excellent.
laughing. You were saying in the break, to a guy who works in a factory, it sounds like we've got it pretty darn made.
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes Chicago such a great comedy town is that we are a working town. And so we don't just accept a comedian coming in and winging it. There's this theory that, if a guy, we don't need to do jokes. We just need to get on stage and talk. That's not our philosophy at Zanies. Our philosophy is people are paying their hard-earned money to see a show. It's my obligation to book a great show, a prepared show for them.
Sure.
And may I say this is why I think Chicago is such a great comedy town. And I think Chicago is a great comedy town because the audiences are skeptical, and of course, who wouldn't be with our political system, but at the same time, they're hopeful. And so there's that sense of optimism. Of course, Bonnie Hunt said, we have to be hopeful. How else do you get through a Chicago winter? So there's that combination of optimism and skepticism, which makes for a good, intelligent audience.
And they love cynicism here.
Right.
Because part of that is...
I prefer the word skepticism.
Skepticism is good. Skepticism dresses that up nicely. I notice even, like, I'm from the South Side and came from a working class family. And that's what I always admired about the Beatles, because they would go into royalty. And you remember when John Lennon said to the Queen, for those of you upstairs, rattle your jewelry.
Right, yeah.
And I always appreciated that. And I said, I think there's something about the working class that always loves to take on that establishment. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what comedy is, isn't it?
Right,
it's
absolutely.
Taking on the establishment.
Yes.
Mort Saul said to Tom Dreesen, remember, Tom, when doing comedy, they're wrong. And Dreesen asked, who's wrong? And Mort Saul said, everybody. And there are no sacred cows for what we do.
There can't be. And this idea of censoring, and this is not politically correct, or this is no. When it comes to the comedy, there are no sacred cows.
But doesn't political correctness scare you? I've never seen comedians from whether they have a political leaning to the right or the left agree on one thing, and that one thing is political correctness, whatever the good intentions, is censorship.
There can't be censorship in humor. Everything is fair game.
Exactly.
And the censorship is capitalist, and it's very simple. If you don't like the program, turn it off. My guarantee at Zanies is this. If you don't like the show, tell me, I'll give you your money back.
Right.
I guarantee you'll enjoy yourself. And if you don't, just tell me.
Right.
Because comedy is subjective. Not everybody is going to laugh at every joke told by every comedian.
And I think if All in the Family, for instance, came out today as a pilot, it would never get on the air.
I think the opposite. It wouldn't get on the air because it'd be too tame.
You think it would be too
tame? They don't. You look at it now, you go, "This is the shock value." But my gosh, there's worse
that's true. That part's true. But don't you think that everybody is so bent out of shape? I'm Italian, okay? If somebody tells me a good Italian joke, I'm going to laugh at it. I'm not tense about it.
Well, you're just happy to hear any joke about Italians.
But
Italians are so starved for attention. Yeah, tell a joke about us. We don't care.
But have
there been any famous Italians, Kenny?
Oh no, a few.
Oh, I have to be careful. Don't tell anybody where I live.
No, there've been a few.
Now this is comedy, okay? People understand that we're not making. Please, Italian American. Don't.
Wait do you see the?
Don't wait to protest.
Wait do you see the parade out in front of your club tomorrow?
This is what we're talking about. Well, of course you should be able to make fun of this stuff.
Absolutely.
Because how else? This is the way comedians communicate their point of view.
Yeah.
This is how they, someone has to tell the emperor he has no clothes.
Exactly.
Comedians do it with humor. They do it by telling jokes.
Now, say I'm a new comedian and I'm 18 years old and I want to audition at Zanies. Okay. What is the process that I have to go through?
If you're a new person just starting out, you're really not ready for Zanies because Zanies is a professional club. I'm trying to hire professional comedians. You want to go to the open mic nights, and there's lots of them, and there's some great ones in the city. By all means, get on stage. That's the interesting thing about stand-up. Although there are comedy classes, and we have them at Zanies, the comedy classes can teach you some of the tricks, much like a writing class can teach you some of the tricks of writing.
And our friend Dobie Maxwell
Dobie does
a very good
excellent,
class.
and Bill Gorgo, excellent teachers. Mm-hmm. But they can't make you funny. Mm-hmm. They can help you learn some of the tricks. You want to find out if you're funny? You have to get on stage. And guess what? You're going to bomb sometimes.
Sometimes. I mean, it's facing the bull.
Exactly. That's all
you have to get up there.
Yeah.
And there's really no shortcut. I have a friend of mine who, will get in touch with me every week and he'll give me the progress of his shows. And I keep telling him, you have to get up there. There is no shortcut to this. You face the bull every week and you're going to have your good shows. You're going to have your mediocre shows and you're going to have your shows where you're going to wake up 2 months from that show in a cold sweat at night, wishing that you had never put yourself through that ever. And that's just the way this business goes. But you get better with time, hopefully.
Right.
And we're going to pick up on this because I've got a lot of questions for you on this. This is Fly By Night. Our guest is the Executive Vice President of Zanies Comedy Clubs, Bert Haas, and we're going to be right back after this important message. Probably a message from Zanies or someone like that.
Get lots of frequent flyer points when you fly by night. Now, back to the show.
We're back with the Executive Vice President of Zanies Comedy Clubs and a good pal, Bert Haas. We were talking about new comics, and we were talking about how they should make their approach into Zanies.
First thing to do is go to all the open mics, get on stage, and work on developing your act. And after you've been doing it about a year and a half, 2 years, because that's about how long it takes to find out if, first of all, if your heart's really in it. Mm-hmm. Everyone can be funny. We've all been funny with our family and our friends.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you can be a big shot with your pals.
Go to the bar with your buddies. Yeah, everybody's laughing.
You
but
bet.
It's very different when people have paid to get in and they're expecting you to be funny.
Yes.
And the other part of stand-up comedy that makes it an art form is that the professional stand-up comedian might tell the same joke a million times, but every time he delivers it, it sounds like the first time.
Yep.
And that's an art form.
And they talk about that in acting, the illusion of the first time. Right. So you might be out doing the play Cats for, 10,000 appearances, but those people are seeing it for the first time.
Exactly.
You got to give them 100%.
Right.
So
after you've done the open mics and you feel that you're ready, Zanies does a Rising Star Showcase first 2 Mondays of every month. I'm pretty open about it. I try and get people in. I actually will make a point of being there, and I work with the comedians and talk to them. And if they make progress, then I try and bring them back, and we start to groom them. And then I start to give them stage time. And, Chicago's a great town for comedy. I can't say that enough. And we're always developing new talent. Every year, there's always some fresh face coming up that is going to be a great star.
What traits are you looking for? So a guy comes in, now he has 15 minutes, let's say, okay? And
he thinks he has 15 minutes. He's got about 4.5.
Well, yeah, that's what Leno said. He goes, when you have 15, then take it and jam it back into a killer 5.
Right.
And then build off that.
There's a big difference between having a 15-minute set and being able to stay on stage and talk for 15 minutes.
Yes, there is. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So then we try and give them stage time. And of course, is when they start getting regular stage time, they start getting paid. So we start treating them like a professional. And then we expect the comedians to perform like professionals.
Sure.
And that is all part of the growth process. And then the idea is that they can eventually leave their day job or whatever they do to support themselves and become professional artists,
right,
and make their living doing stand-up comedy.
Right, and it's a tough business. I mean, guys should be aware of the fact that, don't come into this business with any illusions like, hey, I'll do my first Tonight Show after I've been in the business for a week.
Yes, any art form, I think. I always use the example of Vincent van Gogh. He's a genius. Vincent van Gogh sold one painting in his entire life, and his brother arranged for it to be bought. No one recognized it. So no wonder Vincent van Gogh killed himself. He was a genius and no one recognized it. Yeah. That's how it is in a lot of art forms.
Well, let me ask you this, and this comes back to television. In the old days, you could go and you could do one Tonight Show. And Tom Dries and I were talking about this on the last show. You could do one Tonight Show. And that Tonight Show, Freddie Prinze being the example.
David Brenner talks about that. David Brenner said, my first Tonight Show made my career.
Absolutely.
Right.
So at night, there were 3 networks.
And only one Tonight Show.
Right. So now, television is so fragmented.
Yes.
There are 9,000 channels. This has got to be an impediment to comedians in the respect that if you are looking for a wide audience, you almost have to specialize now, and you almost have to direct and get a cult following,
right,
for lack of a better term. The pie has been so divided up. Who are the guys who have overcome that? There are guys like Dane Cook.
Right. Well, okay. Dane Cook used electronic media very effectively.
Yeah.
Facebook, he used that to build a clientele. And you're right. People, I think the most important thing is to be true to yourself. Gabriel Iglesias has been very effective with that. He stayed true to his character. He's the fluffy character, and that's who he is. This is my point of view. Lewis Black has done that very effectively.
Yeah, Lewis is great.
And Lewis is an interesting character because up until he was about 50, he was a persona non grata in comedy clubs because no one knew how to use him. And then, of course, when we saw him at the first Chicago Comedy Festival, I fell in love with the guy. I thought he was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. And again, that's where luck comes into it. Lewis had a great work ethic. He obviously had great talent. Then he became friends with some of the people that worked on The Daily Show.
Right.
And I remember him telling me that he was going back to New York. I said, "Do you work in there?" He goes, "No, but when I have a week off, I just hang out with the guys at The Daily Show." And he was giving them jokes. And
sure.
And then he eventually started to get segments, the Back in Black segments, and then he popped off The Daily Show.
And it goes back to the old adage, success is an idea whose time has come.
Yeah.
And so, you take everything you've learned up to that point, and there's something to be said for making it later in your career, because first of all, you're going to be smarter with all of the peripheral things that go on with your life, like hopefully your money and understanding this, how hard you've worked for this success, and you don't want to throw it all the way, out on drugs or some other crazy thing.
That is an advantage that comedians have over, for instance, athletes, is that comedians don't necessarily have a career life. Their whole life is their career.
Yes.
And so you don't have to worry if I'm 25, I'm not going to ever be over the hill as a comedian.
Yeah.
I might not make it till I'm 50.
Right.
And so that is an advantage. If you can hang in there and stick with it and work hard, you can make your breaks.
And there's no mandatory retirement age.
Oh, thank God for that.
Yeah, a la George Burns, huh? I mean, my God, the guy's still 100 years old. He has a good-looking blonde on and a cigar. I mean, come on. What a great gig. What a great career. I remember when we all first came up, and I'm going to get to this, we're going to talk about the comedy boom when we come back and what that meant to not only Chicago, but the entire country. Because I wonder if there will ever be a time like that again. And that's a question I'm going to pose to you when we come back. This is Fly By Night. I'm Ken Sevara. This is AM560 WIND. We're going to be right back.
You're always first class when you fly by night. Now, back to the show.
We're talking to the Executive Vice President of Zanies Comedy Club's Bert Haas, and before we left for the break, I asked you, when you and I first came up in this business, comedy was about to experience an unprecedented boom since maybe the golden age of comedy in the Depression. Is there ever going to be a period like that again where you're going to see just if it's introduced to possibly a new generation, can that happen again?
Well, I think there will always be a demand for comedy. People want to laugh, and they'll be willing to pay for that, but they'll pay for it in different ways. I don't think you'll see the comedy clubs like you did in the 80s. That was kind of a fluke of three things. The country was coming out of a recession, so there was more income. The baby boomer generation was coming of age. And then there was suddenly a lot of media awareness, HBO and Showtime, cable television. Letterman got his own show and started introducing stand-up comedians that hadn't been on the air before.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden there was an awareness that, and then Seinfeld got his show, and so all of a sudden it was like, oh, stand-up comedy, let's go see stand-up comedy, whereas people might not have necessarily thought that before. So stand-up comedy became part of the mainstream. I still think it is part of the mainstream, but now there's a lot of different outlets because of the internet, because of cable television, because of network television. So I think there is a lot of demand for comedy, but it's spread out more, much like we talked earlier about the Tonight Show. At one time, there was one Tonight Show. Now you've got Kimmel, now you've got Conan, now you've got Letterman, now you've got Leno. And so there's just as many people in total viewing it, but they're not all viewing it on the same station.
Right. And it makes it, like I said, harder for
it's
a
harder
comic
to break through. Exactly.
Yeah, it really is. And how has this recession been to the comedy business? I know that, previously in the golden age, like I said, the Depression, that's when the golden age of comedy, came into being. And then in the last recession, right about the time Zany was opening, as you said,
right?
People were discovering comedy. Has this recession, because people turn to comedy in tough times to forget, has this recession been like the others?
I think it has, and I point to two shows that have really taken off, and that's The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. Right. Two brilliant political satires and dealing with economic issues and pointing out the hypocrisy and of what's happening in the financial situation.
Sure.
And so, I would say absolutely there's as much awareness. And of course, you've got the podcasts, you've got Sirius radio, Howard Stern. I mean, really, he's an entertainer. He's a comedian. That's what he does. Right. And so, I would say absolutely there's just as much, I would say there's probably more comedy now than ever before. You guys also have a club, and we'll wrap this up quickly, but you also have a club in Nashville. Yes, Nashville, Tennessee, yes. And how is that club doing? That's been around for a long time, too. I opened that club in 1983. Wow. I was only 7 at the time. Okay. Well, that's fantastic, and I know that club's been doing very well for years also. So you guys have quite a legacy going there. Thank you. Thank you for being on the show today. Ken, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. It's always great hanging with you, too. I love coming into Zanies for that reason alone. Well, our guest has been Bert Haas, the Executive Vice President of Zanies Comedy Club. This has been a blast. Well, thank you, Ken. It's always a pleasure being talking with you. And hanging with you, I just love it. Thank you. So, it's been great being with you. Well, and this is how this is really nice. I get to have all my friends in the studio, and while we're all so busy to visit, this provides that. This catches us up. Remember, if you want to write me, you can reach me at flybynightwithken@gmail.com. That's flybynightwithken@gmail.com. I would like to thank my guest on today's show, Bert
Bart Haas, and my producer, Debbie Schreiner. Zanies Comedy Clubs for sponsoring this fine show. And on next week's flight, my guest will be author, playwright, and comedian John Powers, and from Zanies comedian Patty Vasquez. This has been Fly By Night on AM560 WIND. We've had a blast. I hope you guys enjoyed the show tonight. Stay tuned for The Twilight Zone. We'll see you next week.